Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Happy days are here again. I've now been cowed into submission, and I have to say it correctly every time, or else I don't know, some voice in the back of my head will be like, Caitlin, come on, be serious, grow up. So happy days are here again, and understanding your question is half the answer. This is Half the Answer. I'm one of your hosts, Caitlin Green, linguist, editor, writer, person. I'm just a person. I put my pants on one leg at a time, just like the rest of you. And with me is my co-host, Trent Nelson, historian, philosopher, writer, editor. You know the thing. Trent, how are you today?
I also put my pants on one sleeve at a time.
You don't do Wallace and Gromit style, dropped out of the ceiling? That's the dream.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's the dream. Well, Caitlin, it feels like we're living a dream, doesn't it? Because we talk to such interesting people each and every week. I feel like Gossamer in that Bugs Bunny cartoon from long ago. I always talk to the most interesting people. Well, today is no different, for I have brought us a wonderful gift. His name is John Ghazvinian, and, well, he does a whole bunch of stuff. He's an author, he's a writer, he teaches. He wrote a wonderful book, America and Iran, and, well, the New York Times loves it, but we don't care about that. I love it. It's a wonderful book. So many others have loved it as well. If you haven't read it, you should totally check it out. We'll get to that in a little bit. Oh, sir, well, can you give us your background? Can you give us your bio? Can you give us the rundown that I so woefully failed at? And then we can move on to our topic, which is, of course, America and Iran. And, well, there's a lot to get to, of course, over decades, over centuries. What can you tell us about yourself, sir?
Sure. So I was actually born in Iran. I left at the age of one year old. I was born in 1974. We left in 1975, just a couple of years before the revolution. I grew up in the UK and then later on in Los Angeles. I have a PhD in history, but I never went down. I chose not to go down the traditional academic career path and became a journalist instead for a while, and then kind of bounced back and forth between journalism and academia for a while. So I consider myself more of a writer and historian, I guess, than a sort of traditional conventional academic. But I am a historian by training.
Well, certainly we appreciate you finding some time for us today. And thanks for all the contributions you've made across your career, across your life. Well, the topic is America and Iran, and it's a topic that is close to this host's heart. It's always been so interesting to me to see how we function with this nation, which we have a really deep history with, as you go into in your book. Goes all the way back to the 18th century at least. We talk a lot about the 19th century as well, but a lot of my work has taken place in the 20th century. Whether it come from Reza Shah or going forward into Savak. Well, we'd like to start, sir. We'd like to start with a little bit of history that goes where you started. America and Iran have a pretty deep relationship over the decades and centuries, and not as many people probably know that as should. What can you tell us about the very beginnings? And maybe how they intersect a little bit with American missionary work in that area.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it was actually the central question for me when I was working on the book. My most recent book, it's a history of U.S.-Iran relations. It's called America and Iran: A History 1720 to the Present. It's very unimaginatively titled, but we couldn't.
It does what it says on the tin, right?
Exactly right. It was hard to come up with a title that sums up 300 years of history, other than just calling it that. One of my central questions, I was very interested in understanding the history of U.S.-Iran relations. And obviously that is a story that has been told many times. There have been other books written about it. But I think one of the things I was trying to sort of understand is, when does his story really begin? We tend to, those of us who take an interest in the history of U.S.-Iran relations, focus on a couple of really big moments. And they are kind of confrontational moments, because it's a confrontational story, right? So when the moment you mention the United States and Iran, people kind of go, oh yeah, that's a terrible relationship. Why do these countries hate each other so much? What, as a historian, the question then becomes the question that you get asked is, well, how did it go so wrong? Why did this, where did this kind of animosity come from? Which is a perfectly reasonable question. But then I think there are questions embedded in that, which is, for example, if it all went so wrong at some point, perhaps it went right. And so, is there a sort of golden age where things were great and then everything went to hell? And people tend to have their ready-made answers to this question. And as I always say, generally speaking, if you are more sympathetic to the United States and to American foreign policy and more critical of Iran and the Islamic Republic, you are more likely to say, well, everything was great until 1979, when you had these kind of radical Islamic revolutionaries take over the country and a bunch of students took over the American embassy and took Americans hostage for 444 days. And then that caused this horrible rupture between these two countries that had been allies before. And it's never been the same since. And indeed, that is true. There is nothing inaccurate about any of those statements. If you are generally more critical of American foreign policy, or perhaps more sympathetic to a sort of Iranian nationalist narrative, let's say, not necessarily the Islamic Republic, but you are more likely to say, well, everything starts in 1953. That's the real, kind of culprit.
Mossadegh.
That's the year when the CIA, the newly created CIA, overthrows very popular elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the British oil monopoly, and the United States was convinced by the British to remove him covertly. And that caused an incredible amount of animosity towards the United States from the very segment of the Iranian public that would naturally be most sympathetic to the United States, from middle class, liberal intellectuals and nationalists. And that eventually, kind of triggered the Shah's steady drift towards consolidation of power and eventually autocracy and dictatorship through the 1960s and 70s, which ultimately then led to the big blowback in the form of 1979. And so that narrative says, well, everything was fine until the Americans came and overthrew or interfered in the domestic affairs of a sovereign nation. Again, there's nothing untrue about that narrative either. But I think, what I wanted to get away from, and I'm sorry, this is a very long-winded answer, but it's, to your original question about where the story begins, which is, well, is this, why are we always beginning this story with the kind of endings and ruptures and conflict? I mean, this is a conflict, a story of conflict, of course, but every conflict has roots. And simplistic roots of you started it, no, you started it, I find is not really a constructive way to approach history. These two countries had a huge history with each other well before anyone kind of pissed anybody off. And that, I think, is important to realize. And I was curious, where does that begin? Most people who posit 1979 as the start of the story have this idyllic idea of like, oh, everything was great until the Islamic Revolution. Well, everything was great between states, right? Between the Shah's regime and the United States government. But underneath that, there was a huge undercurrent of resentment towards the Shah's dictatorship. Similarly, those who posit 1953 as like everything was great until the CIA ruined everything, if you press them, often it's like, well, how, what was the 1940s like? Do you have a sense of, and there isn't often a strong sense of like, well, was everything so great? Like, what was there this kind of golden age of US-Iran relations in the 1930s and 1940s? I mean, yes and no. In some ways, there was an innocence to the relationship before, let's say, 1940. But we now forget that the United States and Iran actually broke off relations for 3 years from 1936 to 1939 over an incident involving a speeding ticket in Elkton, Maryland, that was issued to the Iranian minister, as it was called then, as the ambassador, whose chauffeur was speeding just before Thanksgiving weekend. And it was the beginning of early days of American speeding laws in the small town of Elkton, Maryland. They were pulled over and the scuffle ensued and a dog, attacked the policeman and so on. And long story short, the ambassador was arrested, which is illegal, under diplomatic immunity. And so it precipitated this huge incident that is easily forgotten now. And it's kind of an amusing footnote to the story. But, then you start to wonder, but it makes you wonder, well, where's this golden age of US-Iran relations, right? So all of that is a long-winded way of saying I was trying to figure that out. The kind of natural starting point would be the beginning of diplomatic relations, which would be in the 1880s, roughly speaking, with the first exchange of ambassadors, or in the 1850s with the first treaty that was signed between the two countries just before the Civil War. But then, is a relationship between two countries just about politics and diplomacy and kind of statecraft, or is there something deeper?
Right.
Is it about people-to-people relations as well? And if so, then there are people-to-people relations dating back to the 1830s with the arrival of the first American Presbyterian missionaries in Iran, who were the first Americans, in a significant numbers to interact with ordinary Iranians, and they brought back to the United States impressions about Persia, as they would have called it at the time, and Iranians first came into contact with Americans, and it was a very positive story for the most part. Even that, though, it's like, well, okay, what about preconceived notions? And I was getting really into the weeds here a bit, but I thought, well, what did these two countries think about before they even came into any contact with each other?
Right.
And that's where the real shock was for me. On a whim, I started looking at some early colonial American newspapers from the 1720s, before the United States even existed, from Philadelphia and Boston. And lo and behold, they were packed with stories about Iran. And I thought, this is bizarre. They were, literally you had, newspapers where 1/3 of the weekly newspaper was taken up with stories from Iran. I even came across a newspaper from Philadelphia in 1722 that said, whose lead story was, "We regret that we have no news from Persia this week." That was the headline, right? It was, "We sorry, we have no Iranian news." I'm thinking, why are people in colonial Philadelphia waiting on tenterhooks to find out this week what happens next in Iran? Well, it turns out that 1722 was actually a big year in Iranian history. It was the collapse of the Safavid Empire, which was this glorious 200-year, one of the last true Persian imperial dynasties, and it was a sort of imperial. There was a sort of imperial grandeur about it that was very much idealized and fantasized about, both in Britain and in the British colonies. Shakespeare, made allusions to it and so on, the Grand Sophie and things like that. I'm going to misquote Shakespeare, but there's a line about, "Not for all the wealth of the Grand Sophie," that kind of thing. There's this kind of really fantastical idea about it. And it came to an end as a result of Afghan rebellions in the East. So this was the big international news story of the early 1720s, which just happened to be when the first American newspapers were being published in colonial Philadelphia and Boston. And they were packed with these stories about Iran. Not only that, but they had this very positive idea about Iran. So Iran was like the good guy, and the Afghans were seen as the bad guys. And the reason for that, very simplistically, was that they were Sunnis and they were rebelling against their Shia overlords in Iran. And the assumption, incorrectly, the assumption, this is actually not true, but it was the first great American media misunderstanding about the Middle East, was that somehow the Ottoman Empire, which was the great power of the day, was secretly, colluding with the Afghans to, just to bring down the beloved Persian Empire that Americans idealized. And the reason they idealized it was because it was Shia and not Sunni. And in a fairly crude misunderstanding of Islam, the idea was that the Shia was somehow less Muslim and therefore less evil and less threatening. Plus the Ottomans, you have to remember, and I'm sorry to do this much history at you all at once, but the Ottomans in the 1720s had just 40 years earlier, in 1683, had been at the gates of Vienna. And for European Christian civilization, and people in Philadelphia saw themselves as part of that. This was the great evil empire of the time, right? The great threat to their way of life. And so because the Persians and the Ottomans had a centuries-long rivalry that also had these layers of Sunni-Shia rivalry built into it, there was a natural, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they idealized the Persians. On top of which, in the Bible, the Persians look really good. It's the land of Cyrus the Great and the Babylon, who freed the Jews from the Babylonian captivity in Ezra Book 1. This stuff may sound crazy, but for New England Puritans, the Bible was the only real source of understanding about this part of the world and a little bit of what they were getting in their newspapers. So there was this kind of weird stuff going on in their minds that, here's this idyllic Eastern civilization. It's a little bit further to the east of the evil Ottoman Empire, a little bit less Muslim, a little bit less threatening, a little bit less evil. And the reason I'm banging on about this so much is that I think that actually that tendency, that American idealization of this sort of Oriental kingdom, lasted right up until the 1970s. If you look at some of the ways that Iran was talked about just before the revolution, it was, the Shah of Iran, kind of, benevolent, Oriental despot with his diamonds and his jewels and his glamorous wife and this, and this kind of pro-Western regime, which was less threatening than the sort of the Arabs that were just to the West, right, in the 1970s, and an oil embargo and this kind of stuff. But I think Iranians had their own version of this, but I will stop there because that is a much too long-winded answer to your question.
I think you underestimate our appetite for that kind of thing.
Right, and you haven't heard my long-winded questions yet, so there you are. Will be a match made, to be sure. There is a sort of a return in the book that Iran sees America as like the better Europe, right. And that America sees Iran as you noted, as it concerns Afghanistan, like the better grouping of folks in that region, better Middle East. And that really struck me, as did what you just noted, how we sort of fast forward to these moments instead of realizing, like, well, what about like the Anglo Russian invasion of Iran? Was that like a good moment? Well, what about, like, as you said, overthrowing a democratically elected a man who I believe was the first to earn a law degree in a European university from Iran. These are big pressing moments. One of the questions I get most often is, about the hostage situation. And we'll get there, but I always like to say, well, they did want to maybe hold their dictator accountable, and America, unfortunately, played a part in not allowing for that to happen to varying degrees, and of course we could talk about what that might have looked like, but well, let's go back. We talked about the 19th century. Well, let's talk about the 20th century. How did we get from the end of the how did we get from 1920 to 1979? This seems reasonably important because there was a switch in dynasties, if I remember properly. And then we have about 30 years of the Shah, who most people are familiar with. But how does that develop, sir?
Yeah, so in the 1920s, the Qajar dynasty that had ruled from sort of around 1790s collapsed for a whole bunch of reasons, under the weight of its own kind of weakness and sort of internal issues and corruption and so on. It was replaced by a new dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, which was the last of Iran's many dynasties over 2,500 years. The Shah, who came to power in 1925, well, initially he came to power in 1921, where he led, with some collusion from the British, he led a kind of coup against the government in Iran. Initially became defense minister, then 2 years later became prime minister, and then 2 years later was actually named Shah, king. There's a whole bunch of internal machinations that go along with that, which I won't bore you with. But basically, he was a very different kind of king. He was very much what would have been seen as sort of modern in the 1920s, which was, this was not unique to Iran. This was true. I mean, there are parallels in so many countries, right? In sort of fascist Italy or sort of early National Socialists of Germany and so on, where you have this kind of strong man rule, this tough guy, militaristic, law and order. What we need is an end to this kind of 19th century sort of wishy-washy, sort of aristocratic, effeteness, where we're not really like, we're the country's being hollowed out from the inside and being taken advantage of by foreign powers and so on. What we need is some good, strength and law and order, and someone who can make the trains run on time, right? And that was the kind of leader that Reza Shah was, the first of the last two kings of Iran, the two Pahlavi monarchs. So he was Shah, he was king from 1925 to 1941. He was the father of the last Shah of Iran, Reza Shah. He came from nowhere. He was a peasant from the north of Iran. He was illiterate. He had risen up through the ranks of the Cossack Brigade, a sort of quasi-Russian organized brigade in the north of Iran. But he was a tough guy and an inspirational ruler in a lot of ways, and he really fundamentally transformed Iran. During his 15, 16 years as king, the country built a railway, it built modernized armed forces, an air force, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, all these kinds of trappings of modernity, factories, and sort of scientific progress, and so on and so forth. But he was also a ruthless dictator. I mean, he was very much absolutely he shut down or I should say, parliamentary elections became meaningless under his rule. Opponents were ruthlessly treated. When his son came to power in 1941, I should say, Reza Shah's rule came to an end in the Second World War, and you had mentioned the British-Soviet invasion in 1941. That came about. Iran had been traditionally neutral, a neutral country. It had been neutral in the First World War as well, although that neutrality had not been respected. But in the Second World War, it felt that it was in a stronger position to be truly neutral. And for a while, the Allies actually tolerated Iran's neutrality. But by 1941, when Hitler had kind of cut off the Western Front to the Soviet Union, the Allies needed a different way to get supplies up from British positions in the Persian Gulf up to the Soviet Union, and Iran's newly inaugurated railway was an obvious way to do that. And there were tons of German agents and spies running around in Iran. I mean, Iran was by no means, it took no sides in the Second World War. But from the perspective of the Allies, the fact that there were large numbers of Germans on Iranian soil was a problem. And so they invaded the Soviets from the north and the British from the south to basically force Iran to join the Allies. And they overthrew Reza Shah, and they sent him off into exile in Mauritius. And his son, his very, very young son, who at the time was 21, about to turn 22, became king in September of 1941. And would remain king until 1979. It's a 38-year rule during which a lot changed in Iran, and a lot changed with the Shah as well. I mean, he came to power a very young, untested kind of neophyte in a country under occupation, under Soviet British occupation and American occupation as well, shortly thereafter. So initially it was an Anglo-Soviet invasion, but the Americans, actually this was the first time that large numbers of Americans came into contact with Iranians. You had 30,000 American GIs stationed in Iran in what was called the Persian Corridor, to actually manage the Lend-Lease supplies, the movement of Lend-Lease British supplies up to the Caspian Sea and up to the Soviet Union in the north. It's a very secretive operation, which is why to this day it's not a big part of American World War II history. Most people don't even know about it, right? The Persian Gulf Command. It's very secretive. And it wasn't a combat operation, right? Most importantly, so we kind of tend to forget about it. But in my world, this was a very significant moment in the world of kind of the history of U.S.-Iran relations, because this is where you had large numbers of Americans now interacting with Iranians. Anyway, during that campaign, and incidentally, the United States, played an important role in making sure that the British and the Soviets actually respected Iranian sovereignty when the Second World War ended and actually vacated Iranian soil, because they had signed the so-called tripartite agreement saying that within 6 months of the end of the war, the Allies should leave. The reason I mentioned this is yet another one of these, because I had mentioned earlier how Americans had this idealized view of Iran. Iranians also had this idealized view of the United States, and it was not without good reason. I mean, the United States was seen as a sort of benevolent Western power that didn't engage in typical imperialistic behavior in Iran. And this was one very good example of that during the Second World War. The United States actually, historians debate how forcefully, but basically stood up to the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War and said, look, you really need to leave. Anyway, 1941, Reza Shah is deposed. His young son comes to power in the middle of a war, in the middle of a foreign occupation. He's very, very weak, and he recognizes that he's at the mercy of the occupying Allied powers. At the same time, Iran has a long history of British and Russian interference in its domestic affairs, and the United States is seen very, very positively by Iranians. So the Shah recognizes in the 1940s that the US is the big up-and-coming power. I mean, by the end of the Second World War, Britain is bankrupt. The Soviet Union does not share this. The Shah does not share its politics, and the Shah was always a more a pro-Western, right-leaning, anti-communist kind of leader, just like his father. I mean, his father was a fascist. They wouldn't have used the name, but I mean, he was in all but name a fascist, with no sympathy for communism. The son saw himself as someone who would be more of a liberalizer, a more modern monarch, less of a dictator than his father. But he was also weak, particularly in the early years, and he would kind of vacillate between cracking down on free kind of opponents and newspapers and political parties, but then also wanting to have free elections, but then didn't like the results of those elections and would crack it. It was a lot of kind of back and forth and kind of indecisiveness about what kind of king he was going to be in the 1940s. A lot of that changed after the 1953 American coup. Where the Shah really felt like he'd had enough of strong prime ministers, and appreciated the strong support that the United States gave. That was the culmination. I mean, already throughout the 1940s, he saw the United States as being the obvious the smart kind of power to ally Iran with, because Britain and Russia had a terrible brand in Iran. I mean, the Iranian nationalists truly hated the British and the Russians, because of their long history of interference in Iranian affairs. And they really idealized the United States. Plus, the United States was the big up-and-coming power, so it made sense for Iran, the Shah, to say, look, we need to get closer and closer to the U.S. Of course, when the U.S. overthrew a very popular prime minister in 1953, that really tarnished America's brand in Iran dramatically, particularly with those liberals and pro-Western and kind of educated, modernists, who really idealized Western constitutionalism and liberal democracy in the United States and so on, and felt like, they'd really been let down. Like their guy that they got so excited about then got overthrown by the leader of the free world. So from the 1950s, and then of course you get into the 60s, where it's fashionable for people in the developing world who are of a more liberal persuasion to be pretty skeptical of the United States because of its policies in Vietnam and so on. Coupled with the fact that the Shah, increasingly through the 60s and 70s, his rule is more and more visibly associated with the United States. So he now, by the 70s, he has this reputation among kind of student activists and liberals and middle classes in Iran as being a guy who was put back in power in 1953 by an American coup and was now buying huge numbers of weapons from the United States, was a close American ally, et cetera, in the Cold War. And even in the 1970s, for example, during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, when the overwhelming majority of the Middle East was obviously much more sympathetic to the Arab cause, Iran chose not to join the Arab oil embargo. They joined it rhetorically, but not in fact. Sort of supported it rhetorically, but Iran continued to sell oil to the United States and to the Western powers, and secretly maintained relations with Israel and so on. So the Shah increasingly came to be seen as this kind of Western puppet, which was maybe you could debate how fair of a kind of reputation that was, but unfortunately for him, it coincided with his growing dictatorship and his increasingly ruthless secret police, as well as in addition to a sort of inflationary, overheated economic landscape in the 1970s, as the country became more and more dependent on oil revenue and so on, petrodollars. It was just a perfect storm, right? So by the 1970s, you had dramatic inequality between rich and poor, dramatic sudden urbanization of people flocking from the rural communities into the cities, an urban elite that was very pro-Western and kind of looked down on some of the more impoverished masses who were more traditional, more conservative, more religious. You had among students and and young people generally a real frustration with a lack of political participation opportunities. That then took many forms. For some people, that they turned to communism or various forms of Marxist, Maoist type of guerrilla movements. For others, particularly those in smaller villages and the slums of southern Tehran, they turned to religious radicalism, which was a relatively new phenomenon in Iran and the Middle East in the 1970s. It's easy for us to forget now because we tend to assume that we have this tendency to feel that as if Islamism has sort of always been there as a timeless part of the Middle East. Actually, in the 1960s and 70s, very, very few people turned to this idea of political Islam was a very new thing, right? So that was really born mostly in the 1970s, and it took the form of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who became this radical Islamist opposition leader in exile. that more and more young radicals turn to for this idea of a return to the country's roots and traditions and away from the corruption and the greed and the poverty and inequality of the Shah's regime, as well as its pro-Western leanings, as well as its dictatorial tendencies. All of that came together in a perfect storm that overthrew the Shah in a massive popular revolution in 1978 and 79.
So, well, thank you for that 50 years of going through history, John. That was really, really brilliant.
You covered a lot of ground for us.
You covered a lot of ground. You were sprinting, and we appreciate it. For our listeners who may have only heard the word, what is an Ayatollah? And also, now that we've gotten there, let's maybe take a step back. What was going on in France in the lead up to the revolution? There were a couple, as you noted, different groups that were in exile there. Not only the religious groups, but of course the leftist groups, communist, socialist. What is the sort of atmosphere like as we're moving towards 1979? Then we can talk about, of course, the mistakes that were made on both sides, as it were, and that'll bring us, I think, with some clarity to more in the modern day.
Yeah, I mean, opposition to the Shah in the 1970s. First of all, it was very much underground, and it was very risky. I mean, it was illegal to be a communist in Iran. It was illegal to oppose the Shah's regime. So there were a lot of these underground movements that were operating, and increasingly more and more out in the open. Initially, so you had Marxists. So you had the traditional Communist Party, the Tudeh, which was a sort of pro-Soviet party. That had been actually banned since the 1940s, but they still sort of existed underground. The younger generation turned away from them. They were seen as too pro-Soviet, too entrenched, too imperialistic in their own ways. But they had a large party organization in Iran and a long history in Iran. Younger generations turned more, and this was not just true in Iran. This is true everywhere in the 1970s, right? This is the sort of the turn towards. I mean, you want to like the German equivalent, the Baader Meinhof group, the Red Brigades in Italy, Black September, excuse me. You have all kinds of movements like this in the 1970s. These sort of, you could roughly describe them as sort of Maoist guerrilla movements. You had that in Iran as well. Fedayeen Khalq and the Mujahideen Khalq were the two largest groupings. The big difference between them, the Fedayeen were kind of classic Maoist guerrillas. The Mujahideen, which still exist, by the way, were Islamic Marxists, which I know sounds a bit weird, but this is the 1970s, and anything goes. There was sort of an interesting fusion ideologically, and they starting in the 70s. They started blowing things up, and sort of targeted assassinations. They even assassinated a couple of Americans and so on. On the sort of religious side of things, there had been some religious guerrilla movements, but very small and very radicalized. But what religious conservatives, I hate, it's not quite the right term, but kind of religious traditionalists tended to galvanize around the figure of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who an Ayatollah in the Shia tradition is a sort of religious leader, the simplest way of putting it, spiritual leader. And he traditionally in Iran, Shia spiritual leaders had been described as quietist, in other words, kind of supportive of the status quo and kind of conservative in the traditional sense of just kind of supporting the law and order and the monarchy and so on. But the Ayatollah Khomeini was the first, from 1963, he was the first of a new generation of Ayatollahs to begin actively preaching against the regime and saying that it's corrupt and it's too pro-Western and too supportive of Israel and dictatorial and cruel to its own people and so on and so on. So in 63, he had given a sermon along those lines that got him in a lot of trouble, got him arrested, and then he did it again in 64, and then that got him exiled, where he eventually ended up in Najaf in Iraq, preaching to Shia pilgrims, and then by 1978, just before the revolution, he picked up and went to France, where he was joined by a bunch of these kind of liberals and leftists who came from Iran and formed a kind of united opposition to the Shah. Iran, very briefly, the Shah's opposition in the 70s came from three different strands, from a kind of, hard left Marxist, Maoist, whatever, that kind of side. There was a sort of devoted religious following of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who really wanted to bring, Sharia and a return to, kind of Islamic principles to the Iran. And then in the middle, you had these liberals who were the heirs to the supporters of Mossadegh, basically from the 1950s, people who believe in Western style constitutionalism and democracy and parliament. They had been largely disillusioned and in fact discredited by what the CIA had done in 1953. So that old generation, the feeling was, for young people who were really radicalized and angry at the regime, there was no natural channel. The middle, the center simply couldn't hold, because this idea, if you had an older generation of liberals saying, well, you should start a political party and maybe a newspaper and sign a petition, you'd get laughed at by young people. It's like, well, you guys did that and look what happened. The CIA came in and, so for young people, there were only two directions to go in, sort of leftist radicalism or religious radicalism. And that is not a good, that didn't bode well for, that was never going to end well, right? So, and what the funny thing is that all three of those, including the liberals, they all had different reasons for hating the United States. They not only hated the Shah, but they also hated the United States. I mean, for leftists, they're going to hate the US because that's what leftists do. Religious radicals, obviously had a problem with the kind of Western-style decadence and immorality that was taking shape in Tehran and so on, and wanted to return to more traditional values. They were the sort of silent majority, if you will, to use 1970s terminology. The middle, ironically, the group that should have been most pro-American, had their own reasons for hating the United States, which is that 1953. So, you now had all of these people who hated the Shah, but also felt that he was an American puppet. It was just a terrible recipe, right? So the revolution was very much a revolution against the Shah. It was not a revolution against the United States. But the graffiti on the streets in 1978, 1979 said, Marg Shah Amerikai, which means death to the American Shah, right? That was significant by itself. But even then, even when the revolution took place and the Ayatollah came back from exile in Paris and so on, in a plane loaded with leftists and religious types and whatever, no one was burning American flags or anything like that in the first few months of the revolution. What changed was, the revolution took place, it was victorious in February of 79. It had anti-American strains to it, but it was not fundamentally a revolution driven by anti-American hatred. It was driven by anti-Shah hatred.
Yeah. By
November of that year, what happened was that the Shah had cancer, and no one knew. He was a very well-kept secret. And Jimmy Carter, President Carter was very resistant to the idea of allowing the Shah into the United States.
He was
prescient, actually. He was right. Yeah. He said, look, this could be dangerous for us.
Yeah.
Let him go into exile somewhere else. Whatever. But he was under a tremendous amount of pressure in a build up to an election year, both from the Republicans as well as people within his own party, including his own administration, including people like his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was saying, this man has been a loyal, steadfast American ally for 38 years. You're going to just leave him out to dry. He needs cancer treatment. He's not well. It is beneath the dignity of the United States to just turn away an ally like this. And more importantly, what are other American allies in the Middle East going to think? The Saudis and the Egyptians and so on. They're going to, when they see that you just abandon your ally like that, this is the Cold War. They're going to turn to the Soviets. So let's let him in. And Carter eventually relented and he let the Shah in. But because his cancer had been such a secret, no one believed in Iran that he was really sick or that he was being let into the US for cancer treatment, even though he was. And most importantly, the legacy of 53 came back to haunt the United States at this point, because in 1953, Iranians had rallied behind this national hero, Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister, around the idea of nationalizing the oil industry and as well as liberalizing and democratizing the Iranian constitution and so on. There was this moment of great euphoria among the young in the 1950s. That dream had been dashed, it had been dashed by a plot that had been hatched in the US embassy, right? And the Shah had fled for a few days to Iraq and then to Rome. And he had been whisked back into the country by the Americans. So 25 years later, when the Iranians once again were in this great revolutionary moment of kind of emotion and idealism and so on, and then suddenly the United States seems to be whisking the Shah away for cancer treatment, quote unquote. you can understand the reaction that took place on the kind of emotional, revolutionary streets of Iran. There was this feeling of no, fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me. And there was this: look, you actually hatched a plot from the bowels of the American embassy to bring the Shah back to power. We're not going to let you do that again. The American embassy is an asset that needs to be secured to prevent that from happening. Which is why you had a bunch of radical students taking over the embassy to make sure that didn't happen. Now, of course, there was no such plot. The United States was not planning to bring the Shah back to power, but that was the mood on the streets at the time, and it didn't help that there were actual CIA agents working in the U.S. embassy. I mean, in 77, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the CIA had actually relocated its Middle East headquarters from Nicosia in Cyprus to Tehran, to the U.S. embassy in Tehran. So Tehran was now the home base for the CIA in the Middle East. Plus, we had, I forget how many, something like 1,100, listening stations, across the Iranian-Soviet border. It was an unfortunate time. It was a bad look for the United States because it was hard to convince Iranians that there wasn't some sort of den of espionage being operated out of the U.S. embassy in Tehran in the midst of a revolution, even though there really wasn't in that way that they imagined. But there was paranoia, there was revolutionary emotion, and so the students overran the embassy, and the liberals and leftists in the coalition government, the revolutionary coalition government at the time, went straight to the Ayatollah Khomeini and said, "You've got to kick these kids out, send in the police. This is a violation of international law, whatever." They had spent the last 6 months arguing with one another over the shape of the new Iranian constitution, and the Ayatollah and his allies on the religious right sensed an opportunity, politically, because of the emotion on the streets. And so the Ayatollah went on the radio and he praised the students for taking over the embassy, even though it was an illegal act under international law. And the entire government resigned the next day in protest. And they said, these leftists and liberals and constitutionalists, we're not going to be part of a government that condones the idea of taking over an embassy. But of course that backfired because the very next month was the referendum on the constitution. And it took place against the backdrop of this anti-American kind of heroism, these students, rushing the. I hate to make this analogy, but I couldn't help it. On January 6th, when you look at the pictures of these guys like climbing over the walls of the Capitol, I mean, I sent out a tweet about this because putting the picture of that right next to the picture of these students climbing over the wall of the U.S. embassy. It's not an exact analogy, but it's a similar kind for a certain kind of political tendency. There is this. Oh, these are these heroic. This is like a heroic vanguard of people who are willing to. To break the law, to do what's quote unquote do what's right. In no way do I condone that, or do would any, but it's a kind of you can sort of see why in a moment of a revolutionary emotion, it made sense for the Ayatollah to. God, I hate to make this analogy, but to do something that was not that different from the way that Trump reacted to those January 6th rioters. Instead of saying no, this is absolutely wrong, we need to kick them out. He was like, oh, these guys are the true revolutionary heroes. These are great guys. And again, for his core supporters and for a lot of the Iranian public, there was tremendous support for the students. And then thus began this year-long crisis between the United States and Iran, during which the two countries broke off relations in April of 1980.
And so now we have relations broken off, as you said, 444 days of hostages. And one of those individuals on the plane with the Ayatollah, his name is Abu Hassan Bani Sadr. He became the first president of Iran. Is that correct, sir?
Mm-hmm.
But he did not remain. But he did not remain the first president of Iran for very long.
Right.
That is also. This will be the last as we move actually into our current times. But again, I think for a lot of our listeners, it is maybe an interesting revelation to hear that the revolution was sort of this like whole Iranian circumstance. It wasn't just this one individual group that we've come to identify with the nation, but it was in fact a full-throated effort by the whole society to varying degrees. But as you noted before with the Ayatollah's eye for a situation. He also continued to play his hand favorably in this circumstance. Um, which brings us, of course, to circumstances that a lot of our listeners actually might remember, like the Iranian-Iraq conflict, which America also has a part in, which, of course, might be useful for understanding why we don't have the greatest reputation in Iran. Give us the story of Bani Sadr, if you will, who passed away not too long ago, actually.
That's right. So he was an old leftist. He was one of a sort of a generation of leftists who were trying to reconcile their socialism with the religious ideology that was very trendy in the 1970s. So he was not technically allied with the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, but he gradually did begin to kind of draw closer to them. A lot of inside baseball that we don't have time for, but basically, yes, he was elected president of Iran during the hostage crisis, explicitly on a platform of bringing the hostage crisis to an end, and he negotiated secretly with the Americans to try to bring an end to the hostage crisis and so on. And once, and there's a lot of murky history here that no one ever, I think, will ever fully understand. But by 1981, when Reagan takes the oath of office and the hostages are released within minutes of his becoming president, Iran is now, the Ayatollah has completely crushed, not completely, he's crushed a lot of the left. I mean, the sort of the left and the liberals have, resigned, from the government and so on. Bani Sadr is a little bit closer to some of the religious types. But by 1981, and by the way, by this point, there is now a war with Iraq. And Saddam, in the midst of all of this, Saddam Hussein of Iraq has invaded Iran in September of 1980. Basically, long story short, by 1981, the MEK, the sort of Marxist Islamists, have launched a campaign of assassinations of dozens of senior Iranian politicians. I mean, prime minister, lots of parliamentarians, cabinet ministers, etc., just are assassinated by this revolutionary group. Why? Because they basically feel the revolution didn't go far enough, and they wanted another revolution, a sort of more Marxist one, and so on. Bani Sadr increasingly falls afoul of some of the more hardcore religious followers of the Ayatollah. He starts to ally himself more with the MEK, but as he starts to do that, the MEK now become extremely unpopular in Iran because they are basically a terrorist organization. I mean, the entire Iranian public is shocked by what they're doing. I mean, they're killing, dozens of senior politicians, and eventually they end up actually fleeing to Iraq and joining Saddam Hussein against their own countrymen. So this is, as unpopular as you can get. Bani Sadr makes in retrospect, the poor political calculation of allying himself more closely with them, and eventually has to flee the country. And he's impeached and very quickly flees the country and ends up in exile in France, where he lives for the next 40 plus years. Until he dies.
You gave us all the information that we needed to get us past the revolution proper to the invasion of Iran from Iraq, and from there we have a lot of unpleasantness for many decades between Americans and Iranians, and we have a Clinton administration that does not take advantage of a reformist president during parts of his time in office. And then we come to Ahmadinejad, who everybody remembers, of course, who is now like a liberal-ish figure in the country-ish. I say ish. He wants to paint himself as I think having turned a leaf. But we are pressed on time, but we can go a little bit over, of course. How do we get from what we just spoke about, from America helping Iraq, America sort of turned against Iran in very many ways? How do we get to a moment where another Iranian leader who spent some time at university in Europe and Barack Obama to sort of get this new vision of what the future might be between America and Iran?
Right. So Barack Obama is the first American president to seriously undertake a sort of reset with the Islamic Republic. He comes to power, at the end of a sort of an 8-year administration of George W. Bush, where there is exhaustion on the part of many parts of the American public with these kind of endless wars in the Middle East, and a desire and an appetite for a different approach. And he's about as different as you can get in the American landscape from George W. Bush. Not only, apart if nothing else, his middle name is Hussein, which is pretty unusual for an American president at that point. And he promises a complete reset, not just with the Islamic Republic, but with the Muslim world altogether. He quickly discovers that American politics is not necessarily conducive. It's not as simple as that when it comes to the Middle East. But he makes a really good effort and spends several years of his presidency trying to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran, and he eventually is successful at doing that. In the teeth of Israeli allies, as well as domestic opposition, not just from the Republicans, but from many in his own Democratic Party as well, and successfully negotiates, along with European, Chinese, and Russian partners, the so-called P5+1, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, in 2015, which is a landmark international agreement between China, Russia, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, the United States, and Iran, as well as the European Union, to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relief from pretty severe sanctions that were many of which were actually placed by the Obama administration. And by the time he's able to really get that in place, he only has about a year left in office. So there's not much. I think Obama really envisaged his vision for the Iran nuclear deal was that it would just be a beginning to a much broader opening to Iran and a fundamental reset of American alliances. He would never explicitly say this, but I think to some degree felt like, balancing American alliances a little bit away from the Israelis and the Gulf Arab states, and allowing a more multifaceted kind of set of relationships that included potentially a better relationship with the Islamic Republic. But that was never to be. He quickly ran into the treacherous shoals of American Middle East politics and discovered that this thing dragged out for like 7 years, by which time he only had a year left in office and no energy or appetite for much in the way of serious additional diplomacy with Iran. And then, of course, Trump is elected in 2016, pledging to pull out of the agreement, and does in 2018. And the rest is history.
The rest is history. But it is interesting, the sort of the way that the presidential years and the Iranian presidential years, how they sort of overlap to varying degrees. So Obama had a little bit of Ahmadinejad, but then gets to negotiate with Hassan Rouhani, who is, in my mind, reformer in juxtaposition to what there was otherwise, but he's not considered that. I know he's considered a technocrat there. But I think that it often gets lost in the discussion that this was just not Obama. Of course, Obama put a lot of the pressure on it, but you need to have a figure across the table from you that is also willing to negotiate in good faith. And our media ecosystem here doesn't talk enough, I don't think, about how pushing back against the JCPOA from the Trump administration standpoint, that discredited that movement, that ideology that Rouhani was promulgating. That discredits it in Iran itself and allows for the hardliners like the Ibrahim Raisis to come out and to become leader, even as the international criminal courts harken back to the 80s, to some of his abuses in Tehran, the butcher of Tehran, right? Really unpleasant stuff. What is, in your view of it, sir, what is the sort of reason why a president, even one who would be maybe not for reconciling, but just from the pure political standpoint, why would somebody pull out of an agreement designed to essentially open doors for further, not only diplomatic innovations, but like economic and commercial innovations over time.
I mean, it's very difficult to know exactly why Donald Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. Though it's important to remember that all of the mainstream Republican candidates in 2016 were pledging to do some version of the same thing. I mean, again, it's not just the Republic. I mean, a lot of the sort of mainstream old school Democrats as well were very opposed to the JCPOA, opposed in principle to anything that might improve relations with Iran. There is a strain of, particularly among kind of mainstream American foreign policy, that says that Iran must remain isolated and weakened, and that the Islamic Republic must be destroyed, or at the very least, isolated and contained at best. Right? I mean, the most liberal of the wings of the establishment Democratic Party would argue for containment of the Islamic Republic. The more extreme ends of the Republican Party would argue for, regime change, war, whatever it takes. And everything in between is like extreme sanctions and so on. There's no real oxygen in Washington for like serious, real, meaningful diplomacy with Iran, except in the form of Barack Obama at the beginning of his first term, and he was quite bold in trying to do that. And what's extraordinary is that it succeeded. The moment that the United States was willing to actually negotiate seriously with Iran, it actually got somewhere, proving that it can be done. Of course, Iran has its own politics, as you gestured towards. And in Iran, there has been and continues to be, and there always has been, under the Islamic Republic, vigorous debate, internal debate about the right approach to take to the United States. There's a strain of the political establishment that says, look, we must defend the revolution and our sovereignty and all these things, but the best way to do that is to take a legalistic approach that wins us friends and allies in the international community beyond the United States, so for example, in Europe or elsewhere, where we can be seen to take a constructive approach that is legalistic, that stays within the rules of the things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and so on, and that by doing that we can actually sometimes drive a wedge between the United States and its European allies by making the United States look like the problem. There's another strain of thought that says, give them an inch, they'll take a mile. That the Americans are simply not serious about, diplomacy with Iran. They do not want the Islamic Republic to exist. And if you concede to them in any way, shape, or form, they just are going to increase their demands and place more sanctions on you anyway. And they're going to find something else to complain about because they have a problem with your very existence as a regime. That is a very reasonable and interesting debate to have. Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, was the biggest gift you could give to the second camp, to the hardline camp. I mean, it was basically proof positive. There was no arguing with that. It was proof positive that no, it doesn't matter how much you negotiate with you, how reasonable you try to be with the Americans, they're just going to turn around and screw you. And it's unfair because who knows what would have happened under a Hillary Clinton administration? We'll never know. She's a pretty hardline figure herself when it comes to these things, but the bottom line is it made it really easy for the hardline anti-American camp in Iran to simply say, you see, you guys on the reformist, liberal, internationalist kind of camp, do you think that you can just play nice and play by the rules and like do negotiations? You're absolutely naive.
Right.
You don't understand. These guys are simply, they have it in for us and it doesn't matter what you do. And here is proof of that.
Yeah.
And it was the kind of thing that was just very hard to argue against. And yet, despite all of that, reformists still managed to win the what's the word I'm looking for? The sort of impromptu presidential election after the death of Ibrahim Raisi in the helicopter crash last year.
Yes.
So,
So that means that even though America continues, and really, John Ghazvinian, author, writer, journalist, what don't you do? You're like Caitlin, you do everything.
I don't know how to put my pants on. That's good. That's one thing. That's one thing she can do that I don't know.
Okay, so you start with one leg. Okay, that's the first thing.
No, John Wallace and Gromit's it, right? He just flies right in.
His bed tips up and he just like gets poured into him.
I think the overarching, we love to sort of look from as high as we can up 30,000 feet or so. and see above the story, right? Broken trust continues to rise up in our lessons about Iran. Broken trust from a nation that looked at us as the better
Oh,
European nation.
having flashbacks to Beijing Palmer's episode. It's the broken
Yes,
trust.
yes, exactly. Broken trust. And, it's something that I talk about a lot now in the midst of the second Trump era, right? It's the trust is built up over time and it feels brilliant and beautiful and strong and vibrant, right? But it only takes us a second, just as in our interpersonal relationships, as in our international relationships, to break that trust. And the questions we've asked in previous episodes, Jacob T. Levy, for example, right? How do we regain that trust? And he noted that there's really not a great precedent for like America breaking trust with the whole world and how that might be resolved. But there is precedent for how America breaks trust with Iran. And yet, as you noted, sir, even in the midst of all this, there's still hope. There's still a chance. So, what would the the American president who wanted to rebuild that trust, what would they have to go about doing? Um,
So I do sort of end on this note in the book with a few things that they would have to do. But it's funny, when I wrote the epilogue to that book, I think I even said that those things are just not realistic in our current political atmosphere. And frankly, they are much less realistic now than they were when the book came out 4 years ago. We are now living in a time where, there's just absolutely no hope for the U.S. for any kind of constructive U.S.-Iran relationship, barring some kind of dramatic change in the facts on the ground in either country, or perhaps in a third country. Or it would take something unusual, take another revolution in Iran, revolution in the United States. It would take something really dramatic. The Ayatollah, the current supreme leader of Iran, not the Ayatollah Khomeini, who died in 1989, but the current supreme leader is, I forget how old he is now, 86, 87, something like that. He's not young. There are rumors about his health, so there is definitely a moment of potential unpredictability coming in Iran politically, and of course the Middle East itself is in all kinds of kind of turmoil and transition. And we live in a moment in world history where it feels like anything is possible. So, I'm not going to sit here and say that a better U.S.-Iran relationship is completely inconceivable, but it would take a sequence of events that I can't really imagine right now under the current situation. Certainly not. The way things are right now, there's just absolutely no hope of any kind of of any kind of breakthrough or constructive dialogue between these two countries.
and because we have previously broken an accord that a previous administration had put together with Iran, there is probably less appetite to trust American deal making going forward, even if a more liberal leader does come into power in America, even if a more liberal Congress comes into power in America.
I'll say, quite frankly, the Iranians, the Islamic Republic, simply does not trust the Democrats. They tend to trust Republicans more because they kind of know where they stand. The Democrats are usually seen as talking out of both sides of their mouths. And Obama's a classic example of this. Coming to power with an unclenched fist, but then also turning around and imposing at the time the most severe sanctions that had ever been placed on Iran.
Right.
Similar story in a different way under the Clinton administration. The Democrats, are on record, many times as saying things like, well, we just need to go through the motions of diplomacy so that the Europeans and others see that we're not the problem, that the Iranians are the problem. Then it's easier to isolate them. And, it's all tactical. Whereas the Republicans say, what they're exactly, they sort of say what they mean and mean what they say. And it's very hostile, of course, much more hostile to Iran and to the Islamic Republic. But there's a certain realpolitik of kind of like, I actually think that in many cases the Islamic Republic prefers that because it's also an easy foil. Because again, in Europe and in other parts, other American allies, when someone like Trump or George W. Bush is president, there tends to be a more anti-Americanism and more sympathy to Iran and, but, lost trust is a big part of this, sure. But also I just think that we're just at such a, the stories move dramatically beyond anywhere I could have even expected a few years ago. It's just hard to be very hopeful. Although the irony of all of this is that I actually think Donald Trump would like a deal with Iran. I think actually I think that he, more than a lot of the people around him, actually, in the first few months of his presidency, really, and I'm just speculating here, it's based on nothing other than just feelings, that actually would have liked to have done this kind of landmark agreement with Iran and, talk tough, but then, the classic Trump thing of like talking really tough and then suddenly saying, okay, actually, let's do a deal. And
I agree. Yeah. I agree because I think a lot of the reason he scuffled the first one is more due to the fact of who got it. Obama accomplished it. He hates Obama more than he hates any foreign power. And so he can't let that be a win. That's the same reason he really wanted to get rid of Obamacare, not because he had something better, as he said, but because it has Obama's name on it.
But in many ways, that's true of like Trump won, right? But I think he's moved beyond that. Like he's in a very different, I think, mental position from where he was in his first term. Where you're right, there was a lot of like resentment about Obamacare, and about the Iran deal and so on. I think at this point he feels Trump 2.0 is very different, right? He's much more consolidated in his position. He doesn't seem quite as consumed by Obama as he was, 8 years ago. And I think he has the luxury, if he wanted to do a new deal with Iran and say this is a better deal and I got a better deal and so on. And then, sleepy Joe Biden never could have got. I think he could have easily done all of that, But again, there are entrenched interests in American foreign policy when it comes to Iran. And of course, the Israelis were not. Again, we were in a different place. This year has been incredible, right, in terms of what's been going on in the Middle East. So, yeah.
Well, John Ghazvinian, author, writer, he's taught at the universities, but don't call him a professor. He has done so many things, and he's come on to Half the Answer to chat with us today about Iran. Of course, we got up to the present, but we maybe skipped a few things that we'd love to have you come back for sometime. If you have the time, certainly we appreciate your time that you spent with us today. And, well, you understand knowing what to ask. Well, that's half the answer, isn't it? And well, this has been Half the Answer. Yours, Trent Nelson and Caitlin M. Green. And we can't wait to see you guys soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on. Bye.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.